Every machine on Earth runs on something, every ship crossing an ocean, every factory running a night shift. Oil is not just fuel. It is the invisible infrastructure beneath everything we call modern civilization, the hidden foundation. Without it, the supply chain does not slow down. It collapses, and twice, in 50 years, the world has been reminded of this. The first reminder came in October 1973, when Arab oil producers used energy as a weapon and exposed the West's complete dependence. The second is unfolding right now, in 2026, as the Strait of Hormuz has ground to a near standstill under Iranian pressure. Oil crossed $100 a barrel for the first time in years. Tanker traffic collapsed. Financial markets began pricing in pain. Here is what no institution wants to say plainly. 50 years passed between these two crises, and the structural vulnerability is nearly identical. 50 years of reserves, policy reform, diversification, and innovation, and the world arrived at 2026 still depending on 21 miles of water. That is not misfortune. That is a documented, long-running failure to close a gap that everyone in the system could clearly see. To understand the present, you have to start with the past. It is October 6, 1973. Egypt and Syria attack Israel on Yom Kippur. The United States responds by airlifting military supplies to Israeli forces, a decision that triggers a chain reaction nobody had modeled or prepared for. On October 17th, OPEC, the Arab oil producers bloc, announces production cuts and a full export embargo against the United States and key allies. The Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa are added to the target list. This is not a market event. It is a weapon deployed in wartime. Before the embargo, oil cost roughly $3 a barrel. By January 1974, it had climbed to nearly $12, a 300% increase. Gasoline jumped from 34 cents a gallon to over 80 cents, and lines stretched around city blocks at filling stations across America. Rationing was imposed in many states, with odd and even license plate days determining when a driver was permitted to purchase fuel. A country built entirely around cheap energy, and enormous automobiles discovered, suddenly and painfully, what dependence actually meant. Because oil is not just in the fuel tank, it is embedded in the cost of fertilizer, heating, manufacturing, and global logistics simultaneously. When oil prices triple, the entire cost structure of a modern industrial economy shifts at once, and the result has a specific name: stagflation. Inflation and economic stagnation running at the same time, a combination the prevailing economic models of the era had called nearly impossible. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost close to 45% of its value between 1973 and 1974, and GDP contracted across the developed world. Unemployment rose while prices kept climbing, a trap that conventional monetary policy had no clean answer for and no clean exit from. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns hesitated facing the classic dilemma: raise rates to fight inflation or hold them loose to protect growth. The hesitation compounded the damage, and it would take the brutal rate shock of the early Volcker era to close the inflationary chapter. American automakers built on large fuel-inefficient vehicles watched demand collapse almost overnight as Japanese competitors stepped into the vacuum and never left. The world absorbed the lesson of 1973 seriously. For a while, then the memory faded, and the structural investment slowed accordingly. Now, you need to understand the geography at the center of the 2026 crisis, because the geography is, fundamentally, the entire story. Draw a line between the southern coast of Iran and the tip of the Musandam Peninsula, shared by Oman and the UAE. That gap is 21 miles. 2 shipping lanes, each about 2 miles across, carry the entire maritime oil output of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iran. In 2024, approximately 20 million barrels of oil move through that corridor every single day, roughly 20% of all global petroleum consumption, not 20% of what is traded on markets. 20% of everything consumed on Earth moves through that passage. The pipeline bypasses Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline and the UAE's Abu Dhabi route, together handle roughly 3 million barrels a day. The Strait carries 20 million. That gap between what can be rerouted and what cannot has been known since 1974, and never closed. For decades, analysts have called the Strait of Hormuz the world's most important energy channel. That description, if anything, understated the reality. Iranian threats to close the strait surfaced in 2012, in 2018, and in 2019, when tankers were attacked and mined in the Gulf of Oman. Each time the crisis passed without structural change. The risk premium faded. The next administration inherited the same unchanged structural exposure. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iranian military installations and nuclear sites, and Iran did not respond symbolically. Missile and drone attacks struck U.S. bases across the Gulf and damaged infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain within hours of the first strike. Iran's Revolutionary Guard broadcast a warning to every vessel in the area. Any attempt to transit the strait would be met with destruction. Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, and Mezi, among the largest shipping operators on Earth, suspended transits through the strait within days of the initial exchange. At least 5 tankers were damaged. Roughly 150 ships sat stranded around the strait, unable to move in or out of the Persian Gulf. Qatar preemptively paused LNG production following Iranian drone strikes on regional infrastructure, a decision whose full consequences for global gas markets take weeks to materialize. Oil, which had been trading in the mid-60s just days before the strikes, crossed $100 a barrel within the first week of disruption. Now hold both crises side by side. In 1973, a political embargo removed roughly 7% of global oil supply from world markets. In 2026, the effective closure of Hormuz placed approximately 20% of global petroleum consumption at direct, immediate risk, nearly 3 times the scale. In 1973, prices tripled over several months as supply adjustments worked through an analog financial system with no algorithmic component whatsoever. In 2026, crude crossed $100 within days, because oil derivatives and algorithmic trading transmit price signals across global markets in milliseconds. Follow the chain. Oil prices spike, energy costs rise across transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture. Fertilizer costs climb because fertilizer derives from natural gas, and natural gas is surging. Food prices rise. Consumer inflation accelerates. Central banks face the familiar trap: tighten to fight inflation, or hold loose to protect growth that is already under pressure. The Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank are navigating an economy that never fully normalized after the post-COVID inflationary surge of the early 2020s. They have less maneuvering room than 1974 offered. The stagflation trap is not a historical reference point in this crisis. It is the live operating environment. Japan imports roughly 95% of its crude from the Middle East, most of it transiting directly through the strait before reaching Japanese refineries. South Korea channels approximately 68% of its crude imports through Hormuz, giving it profound structural exposure to any disruption in the corridor. India faces a dual shock: higher oil import costs and higher LNG contract prices simultaneously, because both benchmarks are indexed directly to Brent crude. For these economies, a sustained closure does not produce a manageable price adjustment. It produces balance of payment stress, currency pressure, and GDP contraction that compounds monthly. War risk insurance premiums for tankers have reached multi-year highs. For a supertanker carrying 2 million barrels, a single transit now costs hundreds of thousands more. When insurers withdraw, as they largely have commercial shipping halts, even without a declared blockade, a soft closure produces consequences just as hard as a physical one. Strategic petroleum reserves are being released in IEA coordination, providing weeks, not months, of buffer capacity before the full weight of the disruption lands on consumers. Now look honestly at what 50 years of response actually delivered, because both the achievements and the failures matter equally here. Energy efficiency improved dramatically. Global oil intensity per dollar of GDP has fallen roughly 60% since the embargo. Strategic reserves provide real buffer time. Supply diversification was genuine. U.S. shale, North Sea, and Canadian production meaningfully reduced single-point dependence on Middle Eastern output. These are not trivial achievements. But the choke point itself was never solved. 20 million barrels a day through 21 miles, with bypass capacity for roughly 3 million. The gap is unchanged. The financial system's sensitivity to oil shocks actually increased in some dimensions because commodity derivatives transmit volatility at a leverage ratio that the 1973 financial system did not possess. Just-in-time global supply chains, engineered for cost efficiency rather than resilience, amplify oil shock transmission through every sector. Simultaneously, there are no buffers left to absorb the impact. The renewable transition, real, necessary, and accelerating, was not deep enough in the right sectors to provide meaningful insulation from this specific kind of supply shock. Solar panels do not move the cargo ships carrying global trade. Wind turbines do not produce the nitrogen fertilizer that grows the food feeding billions of people. There is also a dimension to 2026 that simply did not exist in 1973 and changes the geopolitical resolution calculus entirely. China is now the world's largest oil importer, taking in over 11 million barrels a day, roughly 40% of which moves through the strait. China also purchases most of Iran's oil exports, placing Beijing in a structurally contradictory position that no diplomatic formula can cleanly resolve. The petrodollar system, born from the political settlement that followed 1973, is under more visible stress than at any point in the past 50 years. The financial toll of 2026 is still being calculated. Oil above $100. LNG markets in acute disruption, Asian economies revising growth forecasts downward. Every crisis produces the same political language. Energy security is national security. The phrase costs nothing to say, and has been said after every single oil shock. The infrastructure required to make that phrase real costs trillions, takes decades, and consistently loses the political contest against short-term economics and short-term electoral cycles. The 1973 oil crisis exposed the fragility of a world built on the assumption that cheap oil would always flow freely from the ground to the market. The 2026 Hormuz disruption exposes the fragility of a world that was warned, partially reformed, and nevertheless arrived at the same choke point with the same exposure. The question that will outlast this crisis is whether this trillion-dollar financial shock finally forces the structural investment that 50 years of repeated warnings could not, or whether the world will do what it has always done: absorb the shock, note the lesson carefully, and quietly decide the investment can wait a little longer. The machine still runs, for now, but the system was never designed to run on luck. And luck is what has been protecting the choke point all along.